Hi guys! Last week we told you the scary story of Madame Delphine, the ghost of the Opera House. And if you haven't listened to that one yet, then go listen to it before this one because this ghost actually comes from that story. Built in 1869 by Baron Nathaniel de Rothschild, the Egyptian Baroness Palace is the largest private residence in Europe with over 400 rooms including a concert hall that can seat 2,000 people, a library with over 20,000 books, a ballroom, a theater, and even an artificial lake. The palace is in fact so large that it has its own zip code. When Baron Rothschild was building the palace, he wanted to make it as grand and imposing as possible, so he hired the best architect in France, the same architect who designed the Paris Opera House, to design his palace. And just like the Opera House, the Egyptian Baron's palace also has a ghost. There are two stories about how the ghost came to be. One says that a young maid was sweeping the floor of the ballroom when she accidentally broke a priceless vase. When her employer, Baron Rothschild, found out about this, he had her put into a dungeon in the basement of the palace and starved her to death. Her soul, however, refused to move on and she became the ghost of the ballroom. Other sources claim that she wasn't a maid but a baroness who accidentally spilled red wine over a white carpet and was locked up in the dungeon of the palace as punishment, where she slowly went insane and eventually died. But both stories agree that her name was Dauphine and that she was locked up in the dungeons of the palace. After the Baron's death, the palace was turned into a museum, though the Rothschild family still lives there. And apparently visitors have often reported hearing the sound of footsteps in the ballroom, believing them to be the ghost of Madame Delphine. One day, a group of paranormal investigators decided to spend a night in the ballroom to try and capture the ghost on camera. All of a sudden, they heard the sound of a woman weeping, and then a blood-curdling scream echoed through the room. Startled, the ghost hunters turned their cameras toward the source of the noise and saw the apparition of a woman in 18th-century clothing standing in front of them. She was tall and thin with long, greasy hair covering most of her face. She was translucent and seemed to be crying. Then the figure began to walk toward them, and the investigators ran for the hills. They later developed the footage, and the photo you see here is what they got. Delphine is not the only ghost that haunts the halls of the Baron's palace. In the palace's library, you might find another ghost waiting for you. His name is Anatole de Mouster. He was the personal secretary to Baron Rothschild. He worked in the palace until 1898 when he passed away due to an unknown illness. However, his ghost remained in the palace. It is said that he likes to play pranks on visitors, moving objects around and shaking books off the shelves. Though some believe he is a little more sinister than that. One day, a group of school children were visiting the palace and wandering around the library. They started to run around and play, screaming at the top of their lungs. Suddenly, a book flew off the shelf and hit one of the children on the head. When the adults in the group started to look for the ghost, they noticed a ghostly figure standing on a nearby staircase. It was an old man wearing 19th-century clothes, looking exactly like Anatole de Mouster. And soon after, the apparition vanished. But the scariest ghost story from the palace doesn't involve a ghost at all. At the back of the palace grounds is a small village called Hamlet de Jardin. It was built in the 1800s to house the servants of the palace. But one day, part of the village collapsed into a sinkhole and over 20 people died. It is said that the ground will open up again and swallow anyone who walks on it. So no one dares go near it. Some say that you can still hear the screams of the villagers as they fell into the hole and that the ground beneath your feet is shaking. The next time you visit the Egyptian Baron's palace, keep an eye out for these ghosts. You never know when or where you might see them. Before we get into the myth, let's talk about some basic facts about mummies. Mummies weren't just made in Egypt. While Egypt is famous for their mummies, mummy practices existed in many other cultures across the world, such as the Greeks, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, and many others. But Egyptian mummies are the oldest and arguably the most famous. Mummification was very expensive. Only the rich could afford it because it took a team of 70 priests and took around 70 days to complete the process. The average person would simply be buried with a few possessions and no special treatment given to their body after death. Egyptian mummies were buried with their internal organs. Unlike what is shown in movies and TV shows, they didn't remove the organs and put them in separate canopic jars. They carefully removed the brain and put it in a separate container, but the rest of the organs stayed inside the body. So, why did Egyptians practice mummification? Well, the answer depends on who you ask. According to mainstream historians, Egyptians practiced mummification to preserve the bodies of their dead so that they could live again in the afterlife. This means that they believed in a sort of heaven or hell, where after you die you get judged, and based on your actions in life, you either go to heaven or hell. In order to reach this heaven, however, you had to be completely intact, both physically and mentally. So mummification was necessary to ensure that the body would survive the journey to the afterlife. However, some alternative historians argue that mummification was actually a form of cryonics, meaning that Egyptians knew about the possibility of reanimation, and that mummification was a method to preserve the human body until the time when science could bring them back to life. They believed that the ancient Egyptians knew far more science than we do and that over time, this knowledge was lost. What do you think? Do you think Egyptians believed in an afterlife, or were they scientists ahead of their time? Let me know in the comments. And now let's move on to the myth. In 1826, French Egyptologist Jean-François Champollion discovered the tomb of King Tutankhamun. Inside the tomb was a golden sarcophagus in the shape of a mummy. According to legend, if anyone opened the sarcophagus, the curse of the pharaohs would be unleashed upon them. Naturally, everyone was afraid to open the sarcophagus. In 1922, however, British archaeologist Howard Carter decided to risk it and see what was inside. What he found shocked him. People started to report strange occurrences around the site of King Tutankhamun's tomb, including strange lights and sounds. Some people even claimed to see the ghost of King Tutankhamun himself. Could this be the curse of the pharaohs in action? Or are these just stories spread to attract more tourists to the site? Today, you can visit King Tutankhamun's tomb and see the golden robot for yourself. But don't stay too long. Who knows what you might awaken?